Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating and, frankly, quite controversial idea: odious debt.
That's right. It's this concept that maybe a country shouldn't have to repay debts piled up by a regime that, well, didn't represent the people or act in their interest.
And we're specifically looking at how this idea plays out, or maybe doesn't play out, in the sphere of international law.
Exactly. We'll dig into what odious debt actually means, or what people think it means, and see how the international legal system grapples with it.
We've got some great sources lined up. There's the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor 2024, giving us that crucial big-picture context on debt today.
And we'll pull in perspectives from places like the Brookings Institution and, even general resources like Wikipedia just to ground the basics.
Plus, for the real legal meat, we're looking at academic work from UNCTAD, an article from the Fordham International Law Journal, and some analysis via the International Law blog.
So yeah, the goal here is really to provide a framework for understanding this intersection of ethics, economics, and international law. It's super relevant given all the current talk about debt crises and responsible lending.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. What exactly is odious debt? What's the core idea?
At its heart, it's debt taken on by a government, but without the real consent of the people it governs. And crucially, the money wasn't used to benefit those people.
Sometimes even used against them, right?
Precisely. That's the extreme end of it, where the funds might actually prop up oppression or conflict.
I know Patricia Adams from Fordham International has argued pretty strongly that lending needs to be transparent, aimed squarely at public benefit.
Yeah, her point is basically to cut off the funding source for, well, tyranny by making sure loans are clearly for legitimate public purposes. Makes sense.
And there are historical examples people point to, like the Cato Institute analysis regarding Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
Right. They looked at the debt Iraq accumulated under his rule and argued, hey, a lot of this went to the military, weapons, keeping the population down, not building schools or hospitals. So was it truly the nation's debt?
So that connects directly to what we see now, doesn't it? The Global Sovereign Debt Monitor talks about these ongoing debt crises, particularly in the Global South.
Absolutely. You see countries like Sri Lanka mentioned in the report having to impose really harsh austerity, cutting back on essential services.
All to repay debts that you could argue maybe didn't benefit the average citizen in the first place, or at least the burden falls disproportionately on them now.
Exactly. And this is where the international law angle gets really interesting, because the idea of odious debt has this strong moral pull, right? It aligns with principles like self-determination. Why should people be bound by the illegitimate actions of a past regime?
It feels intuitively right, somehow. But, and there's always a but, turning that feeling into hard international law seems to be the tricky part.
That's the crux of it. You hit the nail on the head. Within international law as it stands, there's no, universally accepted checklist for saying, yep, this specific debt is odious.
No clear definition, no agreed-upon process.
Not really. There are proposed criteria, academic theories, but no binding international treaty or, customary law that clearly defines it and says what happens next. That lack of consensus is a massive practical hurdle.
I imagine the UNCTAD paper you mentioned digs into that lack of agreement, looking at the different legal viewpoints.
It does. It explores the concept within public international law, highlighting the debates and the difficulties.
And the Fordham Law Journal article, moving from theory to practice, that sounds like it tackles exactly this problem. How do you make this more than just an academic concept?
Precisely. It focuses on the challenges of actually implementing the doctrine, maybe thinking about how to assess loans before they're given out, that ex-ante perspective.
Okay, this is fascinating. The International Law blog brings up just cogens. Can you quickly unpack that for us?
Sure. Just cogens norms are basically the super fundamental principles of international law. Think prohibitions against genocide, slavery, torture, wars of aggression. They're considered non-negotiable. States can't just agree to ignore them.
Got it. So the blog connects this to odious debt how?
It raises the question, if a regime took out loans specifically to fund actions that violate these fundamental just cogens norms, like, say, financing a genocide, should the successor state, the new government, be legally obliged under international law to pay that specific debt back?
Wow, that adds another layer entirely. Do they offer any Any precedent or analogies?
They draw an interesting, though not direct, comparison to some cases from the Nuremberg military tribunals after World War II, specifically the Russian Flick cases.
Okay, tell me about those. They weren't about sovereign debt, were they?
No, not directly. They involved German industrialists and bankers and their financial support for the Nazi regime. In the Roche case, the head of Dresdner Bank knew he was lending large sums to SS enterprises that used concentration camp labor.
And he was convicted.
Actually, no. He was acquitted. The tribunal condemned the loans morally, strongly, but legally. They framed it as, well, ultimately a commercial transaction, even with that horrific knowledge. It wasn't deemed a crime under the laws they were applying.
That seems unsettling. What about the Flick case?
Different outcome there. Flick, the industrialist, was convicted for giving funds directly to the SS, knowing about their criminal activities. The tribunal's famous line was something like, "It's immaterial whether the money was spent on salaries or for lethal gas. The knowledge and direct contribution were key."
So the distinction seems to be around whether it's seen as just business, even dirty business, versus directly funding the illegal acts themselves.
That's a good way to put it. There seems to be, historically at least, a reluctance in international law to criminalize standard commercial lending, even when the lender knows the borrower is unsavory or using funds for bad purposes. It highlights the difficulty in drawing that line for financial accountability.
So applying this back to odious debt, even if lenders knew a regime was corrupt or oppressive, proving the loans were specifically for illegal acts, meeting that high just cogens threshold, and then getting legal agreement to cancel the debt, that's still a huge leap.
A very huge leap within the current international legal system. There's lots of debate, lots of advocacy, especially in post-conflict situations or after regime changes, but no clear, established legal pathway to just say, this debt is odious, we're not paying.
Okay, let's circle back then to the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor and the current situation. We have many countries, especially in the Global South, really struggling under debt burdens.
Yes, and it's forcing austerity, which hampers their development, their ability to invest in climate adaptation, you name it.
How does the odious debt idea connect here? Even if loans weren't directly funding, say, just cogens violations, could there be an argument if they propped up deeply corrupt systems or funded unsustainable projects that ultimately harmed the population? Is international law evolving there?
That's a really important question. Legally, it's much harder. Proving that indirect harm or that the loan caused the negative outcome in a way that makes it odious under current legal thinking is extremely difficult, especially years later during restructuring talks.
So the practical challenge of proving the odiousness of past debts is immense.
Immense, which is why I think you see the focus in reports like the Debt Monitor shifting towards calls for fairer debt relief mechanisms generally, things like supporting a sovereign insolvency process, as Germany is apparently considering.
Like a bankruptcy process for countries, essentially?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
A structured way to manage unsustainable debt under international oversight rather than relying on this difficult-to-prove odious debt claim after the fact.
And the report also mentions specific calls for climate-vulnerable states, right? Recognizing their unique situation.
Yes, there's growing international discussion about whether states facing existential threats from climate change, partly caused by historic emissions elsewhere, should have better access to debt relief because the debt burden directly hinders their ability to survive and adapt. That ties back to the benefit of the population aspect, arguably.
So, wrapping this up, odious debt is this ethically powerful idea, touches on fundamental legal principles like self-determination,
But faces really significant hurdles in terms of practical application and legal definition within international law as it exists today. No easy answers.
Still, the potential impact, if it could be applied effectively, is huge, isn't it? Discouraging reckless lending, offering relief.
Definitely. It could shift incentives for lenders and offer a lifeline to populations burdened by the debts of past dictators or kleptocrats.
Which leaves us with a big question, I suppose. As we keep seeing these sovereign debt crises bubble up and we deal with the legacies of various regimes, how will the principles behind odious debt fairness, accountability, benefit to the people shape the future evolution of international law and finance?
That's the key question to ponder, absolutely. How does the system adapt, if at all?
Something for our listeners to think about. And if you do want to dig a bit deeper, check out the London Debt Agreement of 1953. The Debt Monitor mentions it regarding Sri Lanka. It's a historical case where post-war Germany got significant debt relief precisely to allow its economy to recover. A different context, but interesting parallels about prioritizing a nation's future.
Yeah, and just keep an eye on the ongoing debates about responsible lending standards and reforms to how sovereign debt restructuring actually happens. It's a constantly evolving area.
Indeed it is. Well, thanks for joining us for the deep dive into the complex world of odious debt and international law.